You know, it's actually kind of surprising when you think about it. Indonesia has these incredible ancient Buddhist sites, like Borobudur, right?
Absolutely world famous.
Yeah. But the way Buddhism is actually practiced and understood there today, well, it seems it's been really shaped by some uh, unexpected forces, global trends meeting Indonesian politics, basically.
It's a fascinating mix.
Okay, let's get into this.
And a huge part of that story is Buddhayana. It's the largest Buddhist movement in Indonesia, started back in the 1960s.
Right.
And the key thing, initially at least, was that its vision wasn't narrow at all. It aimed to be non-sectarian, like a big umbrella covering Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana traditions.
Bringing different schools together.
Exactly, encouraging people to connect, learn from each other.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got this really insightful scholarly article. It's called Theravadization of Buddhayana, under the discourse of modern Buddhism and Indonesian politics.
Sounds comprehensive.
It really is. The author dug deep, looking at old documents, Buddhist magazines, books from the time, and also, crucially, interviewed senior Buddhayana monks to piece together how the movement evolved.
Getting those first-hand accounts.
Which raises a really big question, doesn't it? How did Theravada Buddhism, the school often seen as focusing on the earliest teachings, become so dominant within Buddhayana, especially when it started out so broad and inclusive?
That's the puzzle, and you have to connect it to what was happening in Indonesia more widely at the time.
Exactly. That's our mission today. We're tackling two main questions from this article. First, what really pushed Theravada Buddhism to the forefront as Buddhayana was growing?
What were the key drivers?
Yeah. And second, how did Buddhayana handle the needs of its many Chinese Indonesian followers alongside the government's policies? Policies aimed at cultural assimilation, basically, especially when Theravada started being viewed as more authentic, maybe more aligned with the state's vision.
A real balancing act.
Definitely. So to walk us through this, we'll look at the global rise of what people call modern Theravada Buddhism first, and how that influenced Buddhayana's founder.
Right, the individual context.
Then we'll dive into the impact of Indonesian politics, especially those policies affecting Chinese Indonesians and the Mahayana traditions often linked with them.
The political pressure points.
And finally, we'll connect those dots and see how it all led to Theravada becoming much more prominent in Buddhayana's public face. You really see this playing out in the national Waisak celebrations, the big Buddhist holiday.
Yeah, Waisak becomes a really important stage, a key moment. Let's start with the founder, Ashinjanarkita, also known as Tibuanan.
Okay.
He was Indonesian-born, ethnically Chinese, and he's the one who founded Buddhayana. And, that initial non-sectarian vision, it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right, it had roots.
Absolutely. His own background was incredibly diverse. Early on, he was exposed to Chinese shrines, Mahayana chanting, but also local Javanese Kijawan beliefs.
Javanese Kejawan. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What does that involve?
Sure, it's basically the indigenous Javanese spiritual tradition. It often mixes animistic ideas, ancestor veneration, mysticism.
Yeah.
It's quite distinct.
So a real mix right from the start. Shows an openness, maybe.
Definitely. And it wasn't just local stuff. He was also involved with the Theosophical Society from a young age.
Ah, the Theosophical Society. They were quite global, non-sectarian themselves, weren't they?
Very much so. And that likely fed into his later vision for Buddhayana, perhaps echoing Indonesia's own motto, unity and diversity. Plus, he was apparently fluent in several European and Asian languages, studied world religions in Europe.
Wow, fluent in multiple languages across continents. That must have given him a pretty unique global perspective. Did the article say which one specifically?
It doesn't list them all, no, but it definitely suggests someone with a very broad intellectual and spiritual view. But what's interesting is, this broad background didn't immediately lead to Buddhayana. When he came back to Indonesia in 51, he first became an anagarika, that's like a lay practitioner in the Theravada tradition.
Okay, so leaning Theravada early on then.
Seemingly. And he got involved with the Indonesian Samkhao Union, which significantly had strong links to Myanmar. In fact, in 1954, he went to Myanmar for the 6th Buddhist Council.
Which was mainly Theravada.
Predominantly, yes.
But hang on, there's a twist here, isn't there? Because just before that Theravada council trip, he actually spent some time as a Zen novice under a Chinese Mahayana monk, Penjing.
That's right. A brief period, but significant. And apparently he didn't completely cut ties with his Mahayana teacher either, so he had these Mahayana connections too.
So why the Theravada ordination then? If Mahayana options were available maybe closer by in Malaysia, what drew him specifically to Myanmar and Theravada in '54?
Well, that's a key point the article raises. It suggests his choice was heavily influenced by the growing popularity of what's called modern Theravada Buddhism within Indonesia at that time.
Okay.
This wasn't sudden. It had been building for decades, partly thanks to groups like the Theosophical Society and the Batavia Buddhist Association. They'd been promoting it.
Modern Theravada. What made it modern? What was the appeal?
Good question. In Myanmar, you had these really influential figures like Ledi Sayadaw and later Mahasi Sayadaw. They were reframing Buddhism.
How so?
They put a big emphasis on meditation-making practices like vipassana accessible to lay people, not just monks. They presented Buddhist teachings as rational, scientific almost, compatible with modern life, and they used more accessible language.
Interesting.
Yeah, the article even hints they might have picked up some cues from Christian missionary preaching styles in terms of making the message direct and relatable.
So less complex ritual maybe, and more focus on personal practice and understanding the philosophy?
That seems to be the gist of it. Ledi Sayadaw, for example, wrote a lot, connecting Buddhist philosophy directly to meditation, and print culture helped spread these ideas widely in colonial Myanmar. Mahasi Sayadaw really pushed vipassana, insight meditation, and his centers became hugely popular not just in Myanmar but across Southeast Asia.
And General Akita was aware of this trend.
Very much so. In fact, it was apparently his Mahayana teacher who suggested he go to Myanmar to ordain and study meditation under Mahasi Sayadaw.
Wow. Okay, so his Mahayana teacher pointed him towards Theravada meditation.
Seems so. And that ordination happened in 1954. Thibaut Anand became Ashin Jinarakita. The Myanmar embassy in Jakarta even helped facilitate it. They saw it as a way to promote Mahasi Sayadaw and Vipassana in Indonesia.
Fascinating. So personal advice meets a growing global trend, pushing him towards Theravada ordination. But his vision for Indonesian Buddhism itself was still broader at this point.
Exactly. Just before he came back to Indonesia as a Theravada monk, he attended the third conference of the World Fellowship of Buddhists, the WFB, in 1954. And the WFB's whole aim was to unite the different Buddhist schools. That ideal of unity clearly stuck with him. It likely inspired him when he founded the Indonesian Buddhist Lay Organization, PUUI, in 1955. That was explicitly non-sectarian.
Got it. And later he set up a monastic order, too.
Yes. In 1960, the Sangha Suci Indonesia, which later became Sajin, also intended to be inclusive.
So you have this Theravada monk, General Akita, but he's founding organizations with a non-sectarian vision. That seems set up for some tension, maybe, especially given the Indonesian context.
Indeed, because while Jinarakita himself was Theravada and maintained links with Mahayana teachers, the political climate in Indonesia from the 60s through to the 90s really started to squeeze religious groups.
How so?
Well, religious freedom wasn't absolute. And there was definitely suspicion towards syncretic movements and anything mixing traditions or new religious groups. They could be seen as destabilizing or not fitting the national mold.
Especially tough for Chinese Indonesians, who were a big part of Buddhayana's base, right?
Absolutely. They were facing specific political pressures.
So how did Buddhayana navigate this? The article mentions the state required belief in a supreme god. How did Buddhism fit that?
That was a major hurdle. What Buddhayana did, and this seems to have been a collective effort by scholars within the movement, not just Jinarakita, was reinterpret the concept of Adi Buddha.
Adi Buddha. Okay, where does that come from?
It has roots in later Indian and Tibetan Buddhism, but it was particularly developed in Javanese tantric traditions as a kind of primordial ultimate Buddha figure.
Ah, a local Javanese interpretation.
Right. And Buddhayana presented this Adi Buddha as basically equivalent to the almighty God required by the state ideology Pancasila.
A strategic theological move.
Very strategic. And it worked in a sense. It was key to getting Buddhism officially recognized by the government as one of the accepted religions in 1975.
But not all Buddhists in Indonesia agreed with this Adi Buddha idea.
No, definitely not. Buddhayana developed this unique chant, Namo Sangyang Adi Buddhaya, including reverence to Adi Buddha. And this caused quite a bit of friction with other Buddhist groups who stuck to more traditional Theravada or Mahayana views that didn't include this concept.
Okay, so internal disagreements too, and the government kept its hand in.
Oh, yes. In 1978, the government set up Walubi, the Indonesian Federation of Buddhist Trustees, basically a government-controlled body to oversee all Buddhist groups.
To ensure alignment with state ideology. like the supreme god concept.
Precisely. They wanted to make sure everyone towed the line, similar to how they managed other recognized religions.
And Buddhayana's relationship with Walubi, I sense it wasn't smooth.
Far from it. Buddhayana was actually kicked out of Walubi in 1992.
Expelled? Why?
Two main accusations, according to the article. First, syncretism, again specifically, things like incorporating devotion to the Indian guru Sai Baba alongside Buddhism.
Oh, mixing traditions.
And second, being seen as too pro-Chinese culture. This really clashed with the government's ongoing assimilation policy at the time.
Wow. Accused of being too Chinese, even while they were publicly emphasizing Theravada aspects. That sounds like a real double bind.
It highlights the incredible pressure, doesn't it? Navigating religious identity, cultural identity, and state demands. After being expelled, Buddhayana looked outwards, affiliating more with international groups like the WFB and the World Buddhist Sangha Council, maybe seeking legitimacy elsewhere.
Let's talk more about that assimilation policy. The article details pretty serious discrimination against Chinese Indonesians. It must have been incredibly difficult.
It was, starting in the late 50s, but really intensifying under Suharto's New Order from 66 to 98. There were laws requiring choices about citizenship, restricting businesses for non-citizens outside cities.
And pressure to assimilate culturally.
Huge pressure. Adopt Indonesian names, Chinese schools were closed, public use of Mandarin was banned or heavily discouraged, Chinese cultural expressions were suppressed.
Though the article notes speaking Mandarin at home was still possible for many.
True, the restrictions were mainly public, but the overall atmosphere was one of marginalization.
How did this directly hit Buddhist practice, especially Mahayana, which often had strong Chinese cultural links?
It led to this push for the Indonesianization of temples, the Clinton.
Meaning?
New temples were often expected to look less traditionally Chinese in their architecture, maybe simpler styles, and many were officially renamed using Pali or Sanskrit terms, Theravada, or general Indian Buddhist terms like Vihara Buddha Prabha.
So changing the outward appearance.
Yeah, but the article suggests that inside these renamed temples, many traditional Chinese practices often continued, perhaps more privately, a way to keep heritage alive while navigating the political climate. Maybe less visible Chinese iconography in public areas, more in private spaces.
Adapting to survive, essentially. And where does Theravada fit in this drive for Indonesianization?
This is where it gets really interesting. The article mentions a magazine, Dharma Prabha, published by the Vihara Buddha Prabha from 87 to 2007. Its main focus was overwhelmingly on Theravada teachings, using Pali terms. It's presented as strong evidence of this public shift towards embracing the Theravada tradition.
And even the national school curriculum for Buddhism.
Still based on Theravada teachings and Pali terminology today, according to the article.
It really seems like Theravada became the sort of more acceptable, maybe safer public face for Buddhism in the eyes of the state then, precisely because it wasn't so strongly linked to Chinese culture during that assimilation period.
That's a key argument, yes. It appeared more neutral or perhaps even more authentically religious in that specific political context, separate from the targeted Chinese cultural identity.
The article even mentions the Indonesian national anthem appearing in early Buddhayana texts. Was that Jina Rakita being nationalistic?
The author argues probably not. Given Jina Rakita seemed quite fluid about identities, it was more likely a strategic move by the movement.
How so?
An attempt to frame Buddhism as an Indonesian religion, rooted in the nation, rather than something foreign or exclusively Chinese. Again, navigating the political needs.
Smart positioning. And did rituals change too?
Yes, look at the Theravada mantra. It's a common chant for transferring merit at the end of rituals, found in Theravada countries like Sri Lanka and Myanmar.
Right.
But in Indonesia, a specific line was added, Sira Rakantu Indonesia, which means please always protect Indonesia.
Ah, adding a nationalistic element directly into the liturgy.
Exactly. It aligns the ritual with the state's focus on national unity, but crucially it does so using Pali, the language of Theravada. So the public chanting sounds less overtly Chinese.
So Theravada's international standing in its Pali language made it a really useful framework for Buddhayana to operate within Indonesian politics at that time. Okay, let's shift focus to Waisak. You said it became a major stage for this Theravada emphasis.
Yes, the national Waisak celebrations, especially from the 1960s onwards, show a really clear shift. Before that, educated lay Buddhists often took the lead in organizing them. But gradually, Theravada monks became the central figures leading these national events. Waisak effectively turned into a major platform for showcasing Theravada identity. It even became, you could say, a site where power dynamics within Indonesian Buddhism played out.
It's amazing how a holiday can become that kind of focal point. The article also mentions that Waisak, or Vesak, is actually a fairly modern invention itself, globally speaking.
That's right. It emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century, partly as an effort to present Buddhism as a unified world religion, comparable to Christianity. Before that, celebrations were more localized, less standardized. Public, national-level Vesak is more recent in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia.
And in Indonesia, the very first Waisak celebrations weren't even led by monks.
Correct. The Theosophical Society organized the first recorded one in colonial Indonesia in 1929, and the first big one at the famous temples, Mendut and Borobudur, in 1932, also run by lay people.
Why lay people?
Simply because there weren't really any Indonesian-speaking Buddhist monks available back then, a stark contrast to what came later.
So, Jinarakita's return as a Theravada monk really seems to be the pivot point for Waisak in Indonesia.
It really does. The 1955 Waisak at Borobudur, led by Jinarakita soon after his ordination, prominently featured Theravada rituals like walking around the stupa, chanting in Pali, and significantly, government officials attended.
State recognition starting.
Exactly. It marked the beginning of Waisak being seen as a national holiday, and the Buddhism being presented was increasingly Theravada in its public form.
And the next year, 1956, was a big one.
Huge. It was the 2500th anniversary of the Buddha's passing, the parinirvana, a major milestone. Jinarakita used this moment brilliantly. He invited international Buddhist figures, foreign ambassadors, really boosted Buddhism's profile in Indonesia.
And the Buddhist magazine Buddhist, around that time, 1958, did it reflect this trend?
Clearly. Its articles often drew examples from Theravada countries to promote Buddhism in Indonesia. It focused on explaining core Theravada ideas, like the Four Noble Truths. There was also a visit by a famous Sri Lankan Theravada monk, Narada, who gifted Buddha relics, all reinforcing the Theravada connection.
And the 1959 Waisak sounded even more strongly Theravada.
It was quite pointed. High-profile Theravada monks from Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Narada, Mahasi Sayadaw himself were the invited guests. Mahayana monks seemed much less visible in the official events. The rituals, overwhelmingly Theravada style, lots of Pali chanting.
And the speeches given then also underlined this shift.
They really did. Jinarakita himself spoke about Theravada monastic rules, maybe subtly emphasizing the monk status in Theravada compared to how some Mahayana clergy function within the Indonesian community.
Interesting emphasis.
And then the Thai embassy representative, Waraprasad, gave a speech promoting the rational side of Buddhism, criticizing traditional beliefs about luck and fortune. This perfectly matched that modern Buddhist angle, focusing on reason and vipassana meditation. He even specifically donated robes and books to the Theravada monks.
It sounds like a very deliberate framing of Theravada as the more modern, maybe more rational or pure form of Buddhism, less weighed down by folk traditions or things seen as superstition.
That's definitely the impression given. The article notes this shift also involved downplaying material objects in worship compared to Chinese temples, more focus on learning doctrine, practicing meditation.
Right.
And Jinarakita followed up by inviting Theravada monks for an actual ordination ceremony in Semarang in 1959, a conscious revival of the Theravada monastic lineage in Indonesia itself.
So this modern Buddhism taking hold in 1960s Indonesia was really strongly identified with Theravada, both for its rational meditation-focused approach and its better fit with the state's agenda.
Exactly. The article talks about transnationalism from above, the state helping promote Theravada, and transnationalism from below. The community itself embracing these ideas and inviting foreign Theravada monks.
Picture though, isn't it? Because Buddhayana itself didn't become purely Theravada.
No, absolutely not. They kept the Adi Buddha concept, which isn't standard Theravada. And Jinarakita personally seems to have maintained some syncretic practices. Buddhayana's identity was clearly negotiated, flexible, adapting to all these pressures.
So the conclusion is?
The article concludes that the definite lean towards Theravada in Buddhayana's public image was driven by two main things: this powerful discourse of modern Buddhism, popular across Asia, and its alignment with Indonesian state policies during a time when Mahayana was unfortunately linked with the marginalized Chinese identity.
Okay, so let's recap the main takeaways. We've seen how global trends in modern Theravada Buddhism that focus on meditation, rationality, really influenced Jinarakita and Buddhayana's beginnings.
Right. And then we explored how Indonesian politics, especially those assimilation policies targeting Chinese Indonesians, created this specific context, an environment where Theravada, seen as less culturally Chinese, became the more prominent public face for Buddhayana when dealing with the state.
For me, the real aha moment here is seeing just how much religious identity in Indonesia then wasn't just about personal belief. It was actively shaped, negotiated, this constant interplay between global religious ideas and very local, very specific political pressures.
Exactly. The desire for state acceptance, the appeal of modern Buddhism, they just intersected in these really significant ways.
It really underscores how religious identity, community identity, it's often dynamic, isn't it? Always adapting to the social and political world around it.
Constantly being renegotiated.
And this deep dive definitely raises points relevant for today. We still see complex links between religion and politics everywhere. We see globalization impacting local traditions. We see communities constantly adapting their identities.
These dynamics haven't gone away.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. In our world, which is more connected than ever, but also sees these strong pressures towards specific national or cultural identities, how do groups, religious or otherwise, balance their own diverse internal traditions with that need for public recognition, for acceptance by the state or wider society?
Could the story of Buddhayana in Indonesia navigating those exact pressures offer us any insights as we watch similar dynamics play out today? Something to think about.